Hey, welcome back to our channel here where we talk about the Beatles, their days together, their solo years, really any part of their history or their music we can talk about right here on Ken Michaels Radio. And this time out, we have Aaron Badgley with us. You might recall, if you follow the Things We Said Today podcast, for which I'm a co-host, he was recently a guest on the show, and he is the author of this relatively new book. Dark Horse Records, the story of George Harrison's post-Beatles record label. Now, I know that some of you like to follow a lot of what I like to call side projects of the Beatles, songs where they produce or write um, or perform for other artists. And in this particular case, this was George's own label that he started himself. And so I'm sure some of you are curious about it. And I'm always learning about some of these other artists, just like people want to dig into Apple Records and all the other different artists who were on Apple other than the Beatles. So, Aaron, welcome back, this time to Ken Michaels Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Ken. Nice seeing you again, by the way. Thank you for having me. Hi.
I've got my George Harrison shirt on.
I saw that. I'm envious as always. And I've seen George Harrison in the background. I see Material World album, and I see box sets. Good for you, man.
That wasn't intentional. I don't want you thinking that in any way. Maybe we could get you on to talk about living in the material world because I'll do 10 shows on that album.
It's, I, you know, I'll digress for a second. I think, one of his most underrated albums. I'm really glad it's getting the attention it deserves now. And I always thought it was the antithesis of All Things Must Pass, kind of stripped down, Nas produced, and see, I was just listening to it today. Doo-doo.
There you go. We just did a show on Talk More Talk, my other
I
podcast,
know. Yeah.
but it's in some ways it's a bit more revelatory to read the booklets that come with it because the one thing that shocked me more than anything else is that Phil Spector was there
Yes.
throughout the making of this album. While George was recording this, it was only 2 weeks in time that the tracks for the album were recorded. Everything else that followed, um, the orchestration that John Barham did, whatever mixing had to be done, that took longer than it took to record the tracks for the album. But Phil Spector was there, and
Yeah.
he did make some suggestions to the arrangements of the songs. I don't know how much mixing he did, but in all these years, he was never a co-producer of Living in the Material World. Only Try Some Buy Some, which was a couple of years old for
Yeah.
Ronnie Spector when they first did it. And so I'm really surprised that in all these years, we never saw Phil Spector get a credit for the album.
I have to agree with you. I don't have the big box yet because there's a big mail strike here in Canada, so we're not really getting a lot of mail. But I did buy the two CD box. It has some notes in it. I was shocked. I had no idea that Spectre was, but it made sense though, right? Because he was working with, well, it doesn't, because he would have, that was recorded in Apple, wasn't it? In England, most of it.
Living in the Material World was recorded at Henley.
Oh, Henley on the Thames. Okay, right.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know why Spectre was there. That's very odd because he was working with Lennon. He had just finished working with Lennon on the Sometime in New York City album.
Yeah.
And so he had to have gone to England to be with George. And I'm agreeing with you. I don't know why he didn't get any kind of credit in the original album. It's interesting.
And even still, when you look at the credits, it reads the same
Yeah,
as when it
yeah,
came out in 1973. Even
yeah,
though, I mean, Olivia and Danny are aware of what's in the booklet, so it's right there. The
yeah.
facts are there, so why not change the credits a little bit?
Good question. Good question.
I don't
I
know.
don't I don't have it. Although it's cool to see it on Dark Horse. It's very cool to see it on Dark Horse Records. I was on Apple. Now it's on Dark Horse. So
Yeah. So we're gonna talk a little bit about, well, I thought we'd start with, and this could, I hope we don't make this a whole other show because it could be. The very first sentence of your book is a
yes.
show to itself. Say, really, Apple Records was not a failure. It was very much ahead of its time. And in many ways, I agree with it, with what you said there. I
Thank you.
mean, the fact that the Beatles took it upon themselves to sign all these different artists, different styles of music. You even had uh, John Tavener on there.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, all kinds of stuff. Yoko, obviously, Badfinger, Mary Hopkin, the Hot Chocolate Band, all kinds of artists, different styles of music. And yet, other than the Beatles and their solo music, the only success really commercially that they had was from Badfinger. And they had four top 20 hits in America. And they had Mary Hopkin with Those Were the Days and Goodbye. And when you consider the fact that James Taylor became one of the biggest artists in music, and his first album, the one on Apple, didn't really go anywhere. You had Billy Preston become a big star in the 70s.
Yeah.
You did have Hot Chocolate have hits in the 70s.
Yeah.
So the amount of success that the other artists outside of the Beatles and their solo stuff was really minimal. So how do you define, why do you say that Apple Records was not a failure, or why would you say it was a success?
Well, because I think the original intention, when you watch the clip of John and Paul at the press conference talking about Apple Records, it had nothing to do with hits and making money. It had to do with we want to fund projects by new artists that we believe in. And if it's a hit, great. I mean, you got the Thingamy which, John Foster, and then you have Jackie Lomax and all these things that the Beatles firmly believed in. And I don't think if you ask them, do you honestly think this is going to be a huge hit? So in my mind, the fact that they explored other music, they went out of their comfort zone. I mean, George producing Doris Troy, who had a track record already. I mean, this is a
Yeah.
woman that had hits in the early 60s and was kind of and then went on to be, so that's my messaging. I apologize. Goes on to work with Pink Floyd and stuff. I mean, it was a success in that way that it just they did what they set out to do initially. I mean, once Klein got involved, but even then, look at Lennon in the 70s, David Peel, Elephant's Memory. I don't think Lennon honestly thought that David Peel was going to top the charts. I don't. I think he thought, I'm going to give this guy exposure, and he did.
Right.
Elephant's Memory, they had a track record too before they signed to Apple. They did the Midnight Cowboy soundtrack, and they were kind of
Yeah.
a known entity, but I mean, they tried, right? And little known fact, I don't know if it's in my book or not, but Jackie Lomax's Sour Milk Sea made top 30 here in Canada.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a big hit. And sometimes on oldie radio, you'll hear it pop up. It's like, wow, that's just very bizarre. But so, hot chocolate got their start. I mean, there would be no hot chocolate if it hadn't been for the Beatles and I just say James Taylor and Billy Preston. I mean, that was a mystery, but there's a lot of reasons I think why those records didn't do as well as they should have at the time, Although Radha Krishna Temple topped the charts in the UK, right?
Yeah. With
I mean, Hare
Govinda.
Krishna Mantra.
Was
Yeah.
it I Am Missing You or Govinda?
No, Hare Krishna Mantra and then Govinda. They had
Okay.
two hits there. I Am Missing You was Shankar on Dark Horse.
Right. Okay. All right. But it's just an interesting topic to really talk about Apple Records, because there was a lot of great music. And I think maybe someone like me, I'm more disappointed because once you discover how good the music really was, you say to yourself, why couldn't it have done better? Jackie Lomax, Is This What You Want, is a terrific album all the way through. I don't understand. Sour Milk Sea. I mean, you've got George Harrison, you got Eric Clapton on there, you got
Yeah.
Ringo, you know, you got Paul on there.
Yeah. It's
How,
almost the
how can
Beatles.
it
Yeah.
not be a hit? And I don't understand it.
I don't I've always wondered that. Although I wonder if I always thought, and this is in my own dream world, maybe Speak to Me should have been the first single. Because I always found that was very much more accessible and then do Sour Milk Sea, but I don't know, Ken. It's a star-studded album. I like it from beginning to end. I like the, New Day, Thumb and a Ride. I love that stuff. I think they're fantastic. And, you know, uh, Modern Jazz Quartet. I mean, there's another one that had a track record that the Beatles picked up.
Yep.
They didn't know from jazz. I don't think John and Paul and George and Ringo were really jazz aficionados, but they still put out these two now are regarded as landmark albums. Certainly Spaces. I mean, I keep reading about Space, how it was, you know, jazz changing, right? And I have a cousin who's really into jazz, and he said, that album got me into jazz. So who knows, right?
Interesting. And even, I'll just close with this. A group like Badfinger, despite the fact that they had the success that they did, they should have had 10 times more success.
100%. But I mean, I I agree 1000%. And Apple of My Eye should have been a monster hit. That is one of my favorite songs, bar none. Like it's just one of those songs that still grips me. Um, I don't know why Badfinger, but then, it was funny because I don't know if you before Apple reissued these stuff in the 90s, you couldn't find the stuff. And it wasn't being played on the radio. You didn't hear Badfinger very often.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking this is a real shame because I had all the original vinyl and going, listen to these records, guys. And I had friends. I had a friend in high school, so just going nuts over Badfinger. I agree. They should have been huge, much more, much bigger than they were.
Hmm.
Who knows?
Now, as we cross over to Dark Horse, wasn't there any kind of hesitation on George's part when he saw the frustration in dealing with Apple? I mean, you actually say in your book that the lack of success of Lon and Derek Van Eaton's
Yeah.
single of Sweet Music, which George thought was going to be a big hit, kind of paved the way for him to want to start a record label.
Well, I think he thought that, I think if you read between the lines, I think he was blaming Apple for the lack of success of Lon Derek because he was, he wrote to Capitol, he wrote to EMI, but he knew that things were falling apart with Klein, with Pete Bennett, and everything was just literally falling apart. You could see it now, not at the time maybe, but now you can see it. And that's 100% why, because he really wanted to release Splinter. That he wanted Lonely Man to be a single. He fell in love with the group. They were in the film Little Malcolm that he was financing. Although it wasn't a handmade film, it was the first film he actually financed. It was an Apple film, but he said in an interview at the time, well, we'll put the group in the film. The hit will promote the film will promote the hit, and
Hmm.
we'll have this great thing. But Apple just couldn't do it. So, he talked to Leon Russell, he talked to a lot of people who had their own labels, and it came up that it was easier for him to start his own label than for him and Ringo to try to buy out Paul and John
Hmm.
and keep Apple going. Because by that point, well, Sue Me Sue You Blues, right? I mean,
Uh-huh.
it was just a mess. And although I was always confused, Ken, he started Dark Horse because of Lonely Man, and Lonely Man doesn't appear on vinyl until the second Splinter album, but that's another story for another time. Um, he threw his heart and soul into that first Splinter album. I mean, you look at the credits, albeit the funny pseudonyms, he worked on that for 18 months. Um, when I spoke to Bill Elliott, he said, we were just amazed how much work, he goes, we would go home at night and George would have been in the studio all night working on it, and he'd still do the day session. Like he was just very devoted to these bands. And I think if you look at the early days of Apple, he was the most involved.
Yeah.
Doris Troy, Billy Preston, Jackie Lomax, Radhakrishna Temple. He was helping out as many artists as he physically could. And then, the side projects, Delaney and Bonnie and all that. But so and he wanted to keep, and I'm rambling, but he wanted to keep Dark Horse small. He learned that from Apple that it can't be big. We got to keep it small. Two, three, four, five artists, but we got to keep it small. So, that's what he tried to do. And on some levels it worked. But again, you just mentioned at the beginning of the show, like the diversity of Apple. Look at Dark Horse in very short years. You had basically R&B, you have Indian classical, you have British folk pop, rock, um, blues, Irish blues. You have a lot of different stuff going on in that label.
Right. Now, why did George decide that A&M was the perfect choice for them to distribute Dark Horse?
A&M was an artist's label. So it was an independent label, but it was owned by two artists as opposed to other record companies being owned by what he would call businessmen. I mean, Frank Sinatra had reprised, but he had sold it by then. A&M spoke his language. Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss both had been through the mill, and they were very supportive of their artists. If you look at the history of A&M Records, they were putting out stuff in the 70s that no one else would touch.
Right.
And they had faith in their artists. I mean, today it's unheard of, but they would put out album after album after album by artists and wait 10 years before the albums, the groups broke. And I think that he liked what he heard from and he did most of his dealings with Jerry Moss, and he liked what they were saying that, it's your label, we'll bankroll it. We'll give you a guy from A&M to promote it, Derek Green. And it fit for George. He felt because when you look at Warner Brothers, when he goes to Warner Brothers, the first thing Warner's does is cut all the other artists. First, the article, they've cut, Kenny Burke, Attitudes, and Splinter, who are left. Dark or A&M seemed to be, from all appearances, anyways. And certainly when I spoke to Derek Green, he said, A&M are really big on this, but A&M had a hidden agenda, right? They wanted Harrison to sign once his contract was up with EMI.
Right.
So it was kind of a win-win, right? And it didn't turn out that way for a lot of reasons, unfortunately. But and then A&M also said, "Here, we'll give you an office in Burbank. We'll give you an office in London." Like he was suited. They were very good to him, and he was good to them in return. I think he gave them good music. Why it didn't sell? That's a topic for discussion, and certainly all the artists had their own views. But good music. I mean, Splinter to me, the bad finger of Dark Horse, and they should have been.
Hmm.
I think much. Don't you think that they're kind
Oh, yeah. I never thought of it that way, but absolutely.
they're Dark Horse's Badfinger. It's just interesting stuff. So yeah, that's a long answer to a short question.
All right. I know that Jerry Moss recently passed away,
Yeah,
but when you were doing your research for this book, did you try to interview him or Herb Alpert?
I did actually. I reached out to both of them, and Jerry was not in good health, so they just declined. And Herb didn't want to talk about it. I got very clear emails. It's just something he didn't want to. I think there was a lot of hurt feelings over the whole thing between Harrison and the A&M. And which is interesting because Harrison, dedicated a song to Herb Alpert, and I think he tried to make amends, but um, it ended poorly. Jerry Moss particularly was not happy with the way Dark Horse ended, and he felt that um, the rug was pulled out from underneath him and Herb Alpert. And but yeah, I certainly tried to talk to them, and unfortunately just wouldn't comment. But that's fine. I mean, hey, you can try, right?
Yeah, okay. That's a shame. I would love to hear what Herb Alpert has to say about George Harrison and working with him. Did he have much contact with George? Or you said that was all Jerry.
It was mostly Jerry. Herb didn't do a whole lot with Harrison because Herb was doing his own music and he was more I mean, they were both musical guys, but Herb was more hands-on production and Jerry Moss was more the business partner of the two.
Okay.
Um, so Herb I was always surprised, quite frankly, that there wasn't a lot of crossover with A&M artists on the albums. It seemed when I spoke to the guys from Jiva, they said, it was weird. We would be at the A&M studios and we bumping into all these musicians, and you think, why aren't they on my album? Like, come play with us. But it was almost like they were a bit, I don't want to say isolated, but they were their own entity on the A&M lot or the label.
Hmm.
So, I mean, Harrison did try though. We got Gary Wright on Jiva's album, and there was a few guest stars here and there, but it was very insular, for sure. But
I saw a similarity here between Apple and Dark Horse in that, from what I understand, with Apple, Alan Klein really only cared about the Beatles
mhm.
group and the solo stuff. He didn't care about the other artists. With A&M, they really only wanted George. The only reason why they signed him was to have a George Harrison album or George's catalog. So yeah, to please George, they took the label.
Yeah.
So There's a, obvious similarity there.
There- there's certainly a parallel going on. And I don't, to Harrison's credit, and I mean this as a compliment, I don't think he realized he was George Harrison. And what I mean by that is that he wouldn't see it that way. He thought A&M were being really obliging. But even Derek Green said to me, he goes, underneath it all, we were just waiting for George's contract to end. We knew he had two more albums with the MI, which was Dark Horse and Extra Texture.
Hmm.
Extra Texture. I always say that wrong. But they thought that they could coax him onto A&M. And when I was listening to, I'm going to digress again for a second. When I was listening to Living in the Material World the other day, it's like 9 years from the time the Beatles did Sullivan. So in 74, the Beatles were still really big. I mean, the Blue and the Red albums topped the charts. Harrison's album made number one. McCartney, Red Rose Speedway, Wings are now breaking out, going number one.
Yeah.
The Beatles were still the Beatles. And I think if you put your mind back to 74, A&M, every record company wanted a Beatle.
Yeah.
And I think when Derek's talked about the help that A&M gave, they rolled out the red carpet, but there was also the understanding, the very hush hush understanding that Harrison would come to A&M the minute. And in fact, 33 and a third was supposed to be on A&M Records on Dark Horse.
Hmm.
But when Harrison did dealings with Warner Brothers, he got sick, he missed the deadline. He sent everything over to Warner Brothers, the cover, everything. And when A&M heard this, they just pulled the plug on the label because they didn't really have to pull the plug in 76, A&M. And I think it's in the book where Jiva are on tour with Fleetwood Mac.
Yep.
They're sorry, you don't get on the bus. You're off. The tour's off. A&M literally just pulled the plug. And James Strauss from Jiva said, A&M were talking about signing Jiva, but once this happened, they said, we don't want you. And they went to Polydor. But it was ugly by the time it ended. So George didn't realize he was a Beatle, I think, in some ways. And in some ways he did. Like he knew that he could get things done because he was a Beatle, but I don't know he realized how much being a Beatle meant to other people around him. And that's a compliment to how grounded he was.
Yeah. He didn't see the clout that he had
I
at the
don't think he
time.
did. I don't. I think that he honestly thought he was just another musician, and like I don't, you look at McCartney, he certainly in 74 was getting Mike McGear record deals with Warner Brothers because
Hmm.
this was courting McCartney, and I think there's a coincidence there. Danny Lane signed to WIA or Warner Brothers in the US,
Hmm.
and McCartney was aware of his clout, still is. I don't know that Harrison had that attitude. Maybe he did, but I don't see it. And every time I talk to someone, no one said anything about there's an ego. Harrison would come in and, I'm talking to Alvin Taylor, who drummed on 33 and the third, and he'd say to George, well, how do you want me to drum? And George would go, well, you tell me. Here's the song. What do you think worked? Like he was very collaborative, very
Hmm.
down to earth, and very giving of his time and his energy. So it's a long answer, Ken. I just ramble. I kissed the Blarney Stone twice, you see. So
It's fine. You can podcast, you can ramble on and on. Radio is another story.
well, you get me talking about Dorcas. It's a passion. I always loved the label, and I was always fascinated. I was always frustrated because there was nothing I could read about it. So I thought I'd just do the research. So I love the whole label. Hey, Ringo Records, the same thing. So
Now, at some point, yeah, and I know that you're going to be doing something on the Ringo label.
I
Uh,
am.
I remember you telling me, and it's in the book, that Jiva opened for Fleetwood Mac in 75. Now, this is the album before Rumors,
Yeah,
but still, that's tremendous exposure.
yeah,
And they found that you couldn't get any of their albums. Well, you couldn't get the new album in the record store.
yeah.
So what good is it touring if you can't even buy the music? So this must have gotten around to George. He must have been aware of it.
Had to be. For sure, he was aware of it and frustrated by it because he was aware. Like you brought up the Lon and Derek Van Eaton. Well, he was aware of this too, and it was, I mean, it no doubt annoyed him to no end because he got Fleetwood Mac. George Harrison got Fleetwood Mac on the tour, got Jiva on Fleetwood Mac's tour because of his friendship with Mick Fleetwood, and that was a whole long story. But he got the tour, and everyone has agreed that Jiva was wowing audiences, and they would go to the local rec. Now I think you're probably younger than me, but you're probably at the age where you remember. I mean, in Toronto, you'd go see a concert and you'd walk down to Sam the Record Man, and every group that was playing that night would have front racked. Oh, there's the Who and there's Heart. Pick them up, go home. So it must have been kind of frustrating for Jeevan to go in and to see Fleetwood Mac, but Fleetwood Mac were on Warner Brothers. Jiva was on A&M Dark Horse, so maybe that was a problem. I don't know, but Dark Horse. Well, I don't even know if it exists. The Jiva single. I had the promo copy on Dark Horse. I have the Australian copy, but I've not found an American stock copy of their single. So who knows?
And didn't you tell me that George actually fronted the money for the tour?
Yeah, he fronted. He in '79 he talked about all the money he poured into these bands and the tours and the recording. And it's what I was, and he even fronted the money for Splinter when they toured America and they toured France and I, opening for Cher. Don't understand that one. Odd couple, but okay. They opened for the Kinks, and all that money came from Dark Horse and George. And George was funding everything. Um, so he had to have been, there must have been some level of frustration because these are big tours. We're not talking about opening in, some shopping mall in
Yeah.
Northern Italy. We're talking opening for the Bloody Kinks, right? I mean, come on.
Now,
So
did George, was he aware when he signed with A&M that he would have to spend the money for these tours himself?
yeah, that was all in the contract because how I found that out was talking to Alvin Taylor because the Stair Steps wanted to tour. But Harrison didn't at that point, he started to run out of money and he couldn't really fund the tour because the Stair Step members lived all over America and they were being put up in LA, and to do the tour would have cost way too much money, and that's why they split up again, according to Alvin, who said, they wanted to tour, but Dark Horse and George said we don't really have the funds. If we could get a sponsor, and this was pre-sponsor days, right? I mean, nowadays, you
Hmm.
know, McDonald's is sponsoring Taylor Swift or whatever it is. I don't think that's true, just making it up. But, everyone has a sponsor. But back in 75, 76, 74, you toured. Harrison toured the Dark Horse album. He didn't have a brought to you by Techniques, right? It was brought to you by George Harrison. Um, and he took Ravi Shankar. Again, that was his expense to take Shankar and the orchestra on tour. So Stair Steps really wanted to tour, but the money wasn't there, and it would have cost too much money because they had to hire session players, they had to hire a lot of things. So now, oddly enough, Stair Steps was probably the most successful band on Dark Horse because From Us to You was their biggest selling single in their career, made number 10 on the R&B charts.
Yeah.
It was huge. It was a huge record. And I just actually I have a radio show here with another fellow from Memphis to Merseyside, and we just interviewed Alvin Taylor, and he said, you know, any other label would have cultivated that success, but Dark Horse didn't have the clout or the ability to turn that into a bigger success than it was. I mean, that single was big, big Ken, really big single.
See,
So
I don't understand. I admire George's devotion to his bands, but why would he agree to pay for the tours when you've got A&M, which has got millions of dollars that they could invest in their artists? You know, isn't that a bit naive? Or is that something that's commonly done when you have your own record company and it's
I think
distributed by a big company?
I'm researching a couple of other books right now. So I'm going to answer your question with what I've just discovered. I was talking to a guy who owned a company that was picked up by Capitol Records. And I asked him that very question because he got picked up by Capitol in '76. And he said, Aaron, we had the label. Capitol distributed us. We signed with Capitol, but we had to pay for all the touring and the promotion. What Capitol did was got the records in the stores, got the records to the radio stations, and did a bit of promo. But everything else, we were our own entity within the Capitol umbrella. And I asked him, I said, was that a typical deal at that time? And he said, yeah, 100%. So I think it was just probably a typical deal that like I don't know who funded the Badfinger tours in the 70s. I don't know if it was Apple or EMI, but my guess it was Apple. My guess, I don't know. But I do know that when I spoke to the guys at Jiva, it was all Harrison. So
It's like history repeating itself between Apple and Dark Horse. Really, it
there
is.
was there was some similarities. Absolutely. I was I don't you know, it's like watching Ben-Hur going, oh, this time he's gonna win the chariot race. And he just doesn't. But
So let's talk about some of the artists. Splinter, obviously. You interviewed both guys in the band.
no, just the one, Bill Elliott. I did have some emails with the other member too, but Bill spent a lot of time talking to me. Yeah.
Okay. What was it like, interviewing him? And when he looked back at his time with Dark Horse, was he just proud of it, resentful, wishing that they could have been much bigger than they were?
Well, both him and Rob Purvis, he was not resentful, and he again spoke glowingly about George. What frustrated him was that he felt that Splinter never got to sound how they wanted to sound. They were a duo very much influenced by the folk scene in England at the time. And their third album was probably the worst for them because Norbert Putnam produced it. They brought in a lot of Nashville musicians to Dark Horse or to Henley in England. And they didn't have a whole, they did covers on that album. They did two covers, which kind of freaked them out.
Hmm.
Funny story, Harrison, trying to placate them, offered them Don't Let Me Wait Too Long as a cover. I would love to for Splinter to do that song, by the way. But they weren't resentful. They were Bill was really sad more than anything. And he said, you do these records and you don't do them so you can play your wife. You do them because you want people to hear some of the music. And very proud of Cost to Fine Town, which was a top 20 hit in the UK and Europe. But, just kind of scratching his head because again, you look at Splinter's catalog of music. China Light has one of the most incredibly beautiful melodies, I think, and it died. I don't know. They couldn't get radio play in the States, and see now both of them felt that the fact that they were in Dark Horse played against them because they said, people would literally reporters would say to them, well, you're only getting played on the radio because George Harrison plays guitar on it, not because you're good. That kind of commentary, and they felt that there was a resentment in the US against the entire Dark Horse label. It was seen as just because George Harrison put it out doesn't mean it's good. Well, no, but also doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to it. You should, judge it on its own merits. So when I was doing the research, I was looking at the radio play of a Splinter in America, and it was scant at best. East Coast, Massachusetts, New York State, they played it.
Wow.
Once you go to that, it was just LA didn't touch it. Like there was no station in LA that would even look at it. Um, so they were a bit sad about that. They were more sad, and they felt that they let George down, believe it or not. They felt there was that kind of they wanted to do well for George. And there was that feeling that maybe they could have done more. It was interesting talking to Bill, and unfortunately it was his last interview because he passed away about a year after I talked to him, and he was great to talk to, and memory sharp as a tack. Because he was telling me stuff that I put in the book that about sessions I had no idea. It's not on the album cover. It's not in the notes. And then you kind of start siphoning things. Oh yeah, he's right. There is this guy playing this and this um and I still think that all three. And I don't think their third album is so bad personally, but I think it's good. It's not Splinter as we know it. Um, What
Were
do you
they actually told the only reason why we'd play this is because George Harrison's on it or it's his label? Did they
some
actually?
some stations would say that. They said they would get this kind of response from interviewers or radio saying, well, just because George is on it, that's how, and it's unfair because that wasn't the case. I mean, Cost of Fine Town is a great song, regardless of who's playing on it or who produced it, right?
It didn't
Uh,
hurt Badfinger that Paul McCartney wrote "Come and Get It." It didn't hurt Badfinger that George Harrison played on and
no,
produced day after day.
definitely. Yeah. This is what they were told. Now, who knows what the whole story is? I mean, they can only say what they heard, right? But if you look at it, maybe they're right. Maybe there was I mean, even Harrison, when they promoted the first album in the UK, and George wasn't comfortable with this, but A&M wanted him to do it. The original pictures, or the pictures in the magazines were the band and had Splinter, then the producer, and there was George Harrison. And I think that was kind of like, I don't know that when Come and Get It came out, you'd have to look at the label to see that Paul wrote and produced it. And
Hmm,
day after day, I mean, obviously it's George's guitar.
right.
If you who's playing guitar that? I don't know, but it's definitely Harrison. Um, but to promote an album by saying, "Well, here's our producer" and stuff, I think that people kind of went, "You're trading on it." And I do want to say one thing though, that the British press were very good to Splinter. When I was going through all the reviews and um, interviews and all the articles. They were very good. They weren't so nice about the other Dark Horse records. I mean, the other stuff got just savaged in the press in the UK. But like Jiva, the reviews of Jiva were scant, but what was there was just awful.
Hmm.
So so I don't know. I don't know, but I don't know what happened in America. Canada, Cost of Fine Town was a hit. I mean, a top 50 hit here, and the album made it pretty high up in the charts. But after that, there was nothing. Although later on, we started discovering things like the Attitudes did extremely well in Winnipeg. I don't know why. Yeah, it was cold there. Maybe they just warmed them up a bit. But Splinter was a mystery. It still is because it's Ken, the greatest compliment I get is when I get an email from someone who bought the book and they'll go, I didn't really know Splinter, so I went on Spotify and now I'm trying to find all their albums because man, they're great. And I
Yeah.
think that's that's what I want. I just want people to listen to the music and judge for themselves. It's good music. It's solid, well written, well constructed, well produced. The second album, Tom Scott produced it. I had a long conversation with Tom Scott about that album, and he was he said I was shocked it didn't do well. He goes, I thought it was he had this great band in the UK. Um, he thought it was going to be a big album. He really did. And he said to this day, Aaron, I still shake my head with that one. I don't know what happened. And he was hot. He was coming off the Joni Mitchell stuff and
Yeah.
Maria Muldaur and all that. He was a big name. And for all intents and purposes, it should have been the breakthrough album, the second one. But
That
it wasn't.
promo guy at A&M.
Derek, yeah.
Yes. Do you think he was sincere when he said he really tried to promote this music?
Yeah, it's funny because yeah, I do. I think he loved Harrison, and he said that Harrison had a way of bringing you in that you just wanted to do your best for George.
Yeah.
So he said the second single in the UK by Splinter, "Drink All Day, Find Your Own Way Home,"
Okay.
got banned because of the word bloody in the song, and at that time was a swear in the UK. So they flipped it over. And I have a review. I think I quoted it in my book where it said the original A side was much better than this B side. Couldn't win for losing. Um, he said the only stuff that was hard, he goes, Harrison would play him Ravi Shankar and say, Derek, I think this should go top 10 albums. And Derek would be going, yeah, I don't know, George. You know, it's just one step at a time. But he said he put on a lot of air miles going back and forth from LA to London, trying to break these bands. And he was working when he was working at A&M, he broke bands like Chris de Burgh and Supertramp and things like that. So he knew how to kind of introduce hard to deal with, not hard to deal, but new bands and unique bands. And I think he was surprised. He said to me, he said, I to this day I don't know what happened with Splinter. He goes, I can't tell you why it didn't work. A&M in England, not so much in America, but A&M in England really promoted. And the theory was, let's break them in the UK and it'll go over to the US, because a lot of bands are starting in the UK first and then would come to the US.
Hmm.
After it cost a fine town, um, it's just they couldn't drum up another hit. And it's not because of the quality of music. It's as I said, China Light is one of the most beautiful tunes. It could be a Harrison song, quite frankly.
Well, I don't know how anyone who's a George Harrison fan, if they heard the first Splinter album, The Place I Love, couldn't love that album.
Yeah,
I mean, it's got George all over it. It's not just the fact that he produced it, but a lot of the songs melodically are songs that George could have done.
yeah.
So, yeah, and it's George's friends playing all over it, Gary.
And he played the album during his tour. So you'd go into the 74 tour and the music you're hearing on the PA system was Splinter. So smart man. I mean, he had Ravi with him on tour playing Splinter. And I I agree with you. A George Harrison fan would just love The Place I Love. I think they'd also dig Harder to Live. I think it's a very strong album and it just I don't know. And I look at the charts and think, huh, this should have been up there. Like it should have been played too, but you know,
How could a song like Lonely Man not be a hit?
well, it was a hit in Japan. I mean, it did break in Japan, and they did a Japanese version of it,
Yeah,
which is interesting to listen to. And they came in fourth in the Tokyo Music Festival, which is kind of like the Eurovision.
yeah.
But I don't know, Ken. How could Lonely Man not be a hit? Good question. It's a beautiful song, melodically, uh, beautiful. I mean, their harmonies were flawless. I mean, kind of like, wow, these guys are on. But it just didn't catch on. But I'm really glad that it's been reissued. So at least, I mean, first album's on vinyl, but you can go on Spotify or iTunes and get all their stuff. Well, their Dark Horse stuff, not the stuff they did after Dark Horse. But yeah, and then there was a couple of albums released 5 years ago of like live stuff that was interesting, which didn't do as well as hoped, but it was good stuff. I mean, I really enjoyed those CDs. So
So I'd like to try to understand. I know that you said earlier when we were talking about Apple Records and whether or not it was a success. In the Beatles' minds, they were more concerned about giving artists a break and putting out music they could be proud of, not so much the commercial success. Do you think that George applied that same idea with Dark Horse, or did he really want his artists to commercially sell?
I think it's a bit from column A and a bit from column B. I,
Hmm.
I think his idea was his artist would sell enough that he could sign other artists. And he talked about that in an interview where he said, I want them to sell enough records so then I could keep signing people and it could sustain itself. So Splinter puts out a record, it pays for this next record and so forth. I think he, I mean, he had the final say as to what 45s are being released off albums. Henry McCulloch said he was very involved in the promotion in terms of getting billboards up and stuff. I think he wanted the stuff to be heard, and I think he thought if people hear it, it's just going to naturally sell. He really loved the Shankar stuff. I mean, that was the first stuff on Dark Horse to ever get reissued on CD. He talked about it. He really wanted that to sell. But the other stuff, I think he wanted it to kind of get out there. He liked it. He was a huge fan of the Attitudes. So was Olivia to this day. I mean, that was the first new Dark Horse product that came out was a compilation album of the Attitude stuff. So they love the music, and I think he thought if it gets heard, um, but see, and they kind of talk about this in the book a wee bit. Harrison wasn't really into promoting his own music. So it's like, George, because you look like an album like Gone Troppo, where he didn't do a single interview, no videos, nothing. He just put the
Was
album
fed
out,
up. He was fed up with Warner Brothers at that point.
100%, 110%. But it's a great album that sunk without people really loving. I love the album and I've loved it since I got it. Um, but he was fed up, but he didn't really do a lot of promotion for somewhere in England. And again, understandably, because four tracks were taken off by Warner Brothers. That was a bit. Harrison had two big slaps in the face. One was when Capitol put out the best of George Harrison, and one side was Beatle music.
Yes.
And that really upset him, understandably. And second was when Warner Brothers said, no, we need to replace some of these tracks. And
Now, I meant to ask you about that because you brought this up on the Things We Said Today podcast, and one of our viewers wrote in, do you have the actual proof that it was Warner Brothers that rejected those four songs, or did George himself choose those four songs to remove?
it was what I was told was by someone, Andy Newmark, who drummed with Harrison's tour, but also helped him with the Summer in England. Warner Brothers identified the songs they wanted off. So Harrison didn't just willy-nilly pick them. They were identified by Warner Brothers. They weren't commercial enough. They brought the album. They felt the album was too sluggish. And those four songs which is interesting because some of the other ones I thought, really? Because a couple of them are just incredible
Flying Hour
flying hours.
could have been a hit.
I,
I'm not suggesting it would have gone to number one, but it could have been a top 20
Warner Brothers didn't think
follow
so,
up
but
to all those years ago.
yeah, I, I hear you. But and then Harrison's response. I mean, I'm surprised they put out Blood from a Clone. Like
Yeah.
wow, you're not going to put out Flying Hour, but you're going to put out Blood from a Clone. Okay. Uh, yeah. That now, am I 100%, 100% accurate? Not 100, but 98. How about that? That they were identified by Warner Brothers as they got to come off, and the cover. That for is a fact. They hated the original album cover.
Hmm.
Warner Brothers. They thought it was just too unattractive. Um, you know, who knows, right? But so you're right. He was fed up. By the time Gone Trouble had come out, he was done. And I don't think he dug the music, but boy, I tell you, he played the game with Cloud 9. He came out swinging that bat, hitting 1,000, right? I mean, well, definitely 500, not 1,000. He did the interviews, he did the videos, he did two for Got My Mind Set on You, 12-inch box sets. It was
Oh,
great. He took a card from McCartney's playbook. About, okay, Paul, what did you? Oh, you want a low box set? I'll do a box set. You want a color a picture disc? Let's do a picture disc. It's great.
huh. Well, that was one moment when he kind of gave in and did what the record company wanted him to do. But still, I think George always did everything on his own terms, ultimately. He wouldn't have done what he did if he didn't want Cloud 9 to do well.
That's right. Oh, he didn't do it because Waters told him to do it. He did it because he want at that point in time, for whatever reason, I think he had a point. I think he wanted to prove a point too. I think he wanted to prove he was still viable, and he was. I mean, Traveling Wilburys right after it. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, that's just work of art, and that was him. I mean, he got that whole thing going, and so yeah. I mean, I do think going back to your question, I think he did want the stuff to at least sell enough to sustain a label, and it McCulloch didn't sell at all, which is to this day a mystery to me. Great album, Henry McCulloch, Mind Your Own Business.
Hmm.
Attitudes. David Foster even said, if we'd done some shows in LA, that probably would have helped. I mean, I agree with them. I think if they had done some shows, because they were kind of like a super group, and those two albums, Attitudes and Good News, they hold up. They actually sound better now than they did back in 75 and 77, 76, 77.
How did
So
Attitude start? Was it really because I know a lot of the musicians were on Extra Texture?
Well, it actually started because of this jam session that used to happen with Jim Keltner. It was like the Jim Keltner fan club, and they would do this on Sunday nights. They used to get together and they would jam in a studio, and most of them were from Extra Texture, except for Danny Critchmar. It wasn't on Extra Texture, but they would jam, and then the four of them kind of started gelling and started writing and doing this. And I remember reading the book. Harrison was really upset that they didn't come to him. It came to him kind of back door, and he was like, "Why don't you, Jim Kellner? Why didn't you just come and play? I didn't want to abuse our friendship." Oh no, don't be silly. But that's how that started. It was just well, it's even on the back of the Dark Horse or the Jim Kellner fan club. Send a self-addressed stomped undressed elephant. But that was a thing in LA. It was just Jim Kellner. All these session players would get together and just jam, you know? So,
It's a good record. I know I told you it reminded me a bit of the Average White Band kind of a sound.
okay. But to that point, Average Right Band were huge. So
Hmm.
there was really no reason why Attitudes um, didn't make it bigger than they did. In fact, when James Taylor covered one of the songs, it did Honey Don't Leave LA. It was a minor hit for James Taylor. I mean, it charted. It didn't go number one, but it charted. And it didn't chart for the Attitudes. Same
You,
song.
you certainly can't say it had a George Harrison sound to it. So it's not like it's playing off of that, just that it's George's label.
No, it doesn't sound like George Harrison whatsoever, but he
Yeah,
dug it. He really loved it.
yeah.
So,
But I'm
no,
sorry for any radio station that would say, well, you're playing off of George Harrison here and it's got George playing on it. It was very far removed from George. From
oh, far removed as possible. I mean,
yeah,
it was, I like your comparison to Average White Band. I think you're right. With a bit of Steely Dan. Yeah. I mean, these guys are top-notch musicians, you know,
yeah.
David Foster and it's funny to read about it in David Foster's autobiography because it's like a blip in his career, but he still remembers it fondly and he speaks very positively about those two albums. Why not? They're good albums, both of them.
Hmm.
And they should have done better than they did, in my opinion. Maybe if they'd done some gigging, interviews, anything. Try to find interviews with any members of the band when the album came out. They're just not around. They didn't do it.
Wouldn't
I
George try to press them to do that?
I would think, yeah. And George said in '79 he got fed up trying to get these people to do things like that. I mean, when he was interviewed with Rolling Stone in '79, George was very just not overly complimentary about some of the artists. He didn't name them by name. He talked very favorably about Shankar, but he and the Attitudes, but he didn't talk about anyone else in a glowing light. But I mean, Henry McCulloch did the German TV show, and which you can buy on DVD now, and he did most of the album on this German show, and he tried, but and he did a few interviews, but Ken, that's the one key I kept trying to find the answer to the question, why did it happen the way it did? Um, and I'm not finding an answer, you know, but
You
lack of
think that
promotion.
he felt that the artists wanted George to do all the work business-wise for them and all
Yeah,
the promotion for them? They should concentrate on the music only and everything else will take care of itself?
right. But part of taking care of itself was promoting. Like Harrison is very clear in that interview in '79 that and actually in the 2000s or late '90s when he was doing an AOL chat thing, he talked a bit about it, saying, you know, these guys didn't want to do anything. Like, and David Foster says as much in his book. He said, we were not going to tour. We weren't going to do anything. We just wanted the music to sell, man. So it doesn't work that way, David, unfortunately.
He
Um,
certainly learned that later on with all the success he had.
oh yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, wildfire can only hold you for so long, right?
Mm.
It's an interesting era of Harrison's career, and even his own records on Dark Horse are fascinating. The George Harrison album, you know, and I hate drawing comparisons, but it's kind of like his Rubber Soul. It's a very peaceful, very acoustic. It's very again, he kind of stripped it back a bit. And Russ Titleman, great, great choice of a co-producer on that album. Great choice. Um, Blow Away, again, top five here in Canada. Um,
Top 20 here.
yeah, it was monster here in Canada. I was very happy when it was out because you would turn on the radio and you'd hear it, and you'd hear that and Getting Closer or Good Night Tonight. I was a happy boy.
Yeah.
Now, why didn't Love Comes to Everyone work as a single? Your guess is as good as mine. That's again, should
You
have been a
know,
hit.
I love Love Comes to Everyone, but I would have picked If You Believe over that. I think
Yeah,
that's
well, especially, yeah. Well, Gary Wright's coming off of big monster hits, and it's a great song. I Ken, Faster to me is one of the finest songs ever written, not
hmm,
just by Harrison, just ever written. Bombed as a single in the UK and Europe, and I don't know why. It's a great song, great video, fun, well, promo film, they called it then. Uh, but everything is working, and it should have been that monster hit, but just didn't get the airplay.
hmm. I don't know. I don't understand it. I love most of the Beatles solo music. And, when people argue this point with me, they'll say, well, music was changing. There was a lot of competition. You didn't really hear what kind of song sounded like faster on the radio back then.
Nothing.
That should be that should be an advantage in a way,
Yeah,
you think. But no, and I'm really happy that Blow Away did. I mean, that what a perfect springtime song.
I know. It's such
You
a,
know?
it's such a feel-good song.
Yeah. Every time I hear that song, I think about when I got up early in the morning and went to college, drove in my car and heard Blow Away on the radio. What
Yeah.
a great feeling that it was. But yeah, I mean George's catalog to me it's very solid all the way through. Not counting Wonderwall music and electronic sound, which are, in a world of its own, both of those albums. But Extra Texture is probably the weakest, but I think most of his albums are really solid.
But even Extra Texture has some, like, one, This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying.
Yeah.
Just blows me away each and every time I hear it. I'll put it on and kind of go, "Oh, listen to this song." And I love World of Stone,
Me too.
and I love that song so much. But I agree with you that his catalog, right up to Brainwashed, there's, I mean, Brainwashed was an incredible, again, should have been bigger than it was. I mean, Stuck Inside a Cloud. Oh my gosh, that was, you know, Any Road, I the title track. It's just it's just class album.
Tell me about it. I love all this stuff, and I'm not saying that just because I'm a Beatle fan. I grew to love all four of them for their individual styles, and to me that they put out most of their best music on their own because their solo catalog is so huge, you know?
No argument for me, and I agree with you, and I it's interesting in 2024 to kind of look back on it because we lived through it. So we remember when George Harrison came out or somewhere in England. And I look at someone like my daughter, who's 25, and all of her friends are just George mad, and they're digging up all of his albums, and they're calling me going, "What do you know about this album?" You're like, "Well, listen to it," and then call. But they're loving it, and they're thinking it's like today's music in their heads. They're listening to it and thinking. I had one of her friends call me up and said, "Mr. Badgley, this Dark Horse album. Oh my God." I'm like, "Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Simply Shady. Fantastic." Um, so I agree with you. I think that for far too long, because people compared their solo stuff to the Beatles, which is, I don't know how you can do that. It's a continuation. It's all it is. And
Yep.
and Lennon was right. If you're that desperate, just take some songs off each album and make your own Beatle album. But I mean, I love Harrison's. I mean, I love all four of them. I'm not saying he's my favorite, but I kind of grew very attached to George over the years, and I mean, just great stuff. And the Wilburys albums, and even the song he did for movies like Water, which kind of got buried, or the Shanghai Surprise songs are great. What a missed opportunity. I don't care if the film didn't do well. the songs in that film are just fantastic. So, I mean, they came out in dribs and drabs, but should have been an
I agree
album.
with you. I
Yeah.
feel in some ways the solo music is similar in the Beatles music in that even though I'm saying Extra Texture is probably his weakest album, I still love most of the music on
Yeah.
there. It's just
Yeah.
a question of what you like more.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
the Beatles' weakest stuff I still like,
Yeah.
but I still like I like other stuff more than that. That's all.
Yeah. No, no, no. I know exactly what you mean. Like you're not saying it's a terrible album. I don't want to put it on. It's like it's just like certain Beatle albums, I gravitate towards more often than others.
Yeah.
And same with George. I mean, I find that I've had certain albums on the turntable a lot more than others, only because it's my taste at that time, right? Like I 33 and a third. I was at the Beatle convention in Chicago and I was talking to someone and I said, well, 33 and a third is one of my favorite albums of all time. Oh, it's a terrible album. No, no, it's not. It's a work of freaking art.
Uh,
Cracker Barrel's Palace, You Are the One, Beautiful Girl. It's What You Value. It's just a killer album from beginning to end, in my mind.
you mean Dear One?
Dear One,
You were
sorry.
the one. You mean life itself? I
Oh,
know.
oh,
It's easy to get it
oh.
all mixed up.
Yes, I was actually thinking Life Itself. Oh my gosh, I'm a big fan, as my daughter would say.
No,
Be-
I know some people will probably bang their head against the wall when they hear me say something like this, but so much of it is just you hear over the years, well, it was never the same once the Beatles broke up. If you took a lot of these solo songs that people never heard before and you said, this song is really the Beatles in 1969, and it's called let's see, let me think of something here. Since you mentioned 33 and a third. It's called Beautiful Girl, although he actually wrote that around 69, 70 anyway. But if you played that recording, A Beautiful Girl, and you told that person that's a Beatles recording, then they'll say, this is really good.
Well, I used
What
to
do you
laugh at
put that
that.
thought in people's head that it must be better if it's the Beatles? It's the most important thing is that it's the same songwriters, it's the
Yeah,
same artists, it's the same brains, it's the same creators. And what the Beatles brought to their own music when they were together is certainly added so much to their recordings, but the songs always mattered first to me.
right.
And they never stopped writing great songs on their own.
Yeah, I used to, what you just did there. I used to do that with Not Guilty, and they go, "Oh, this song is terrible." Really? Because it's an outtake from White Album. Is it? Oh, it's great. No, well, which is that? But yeah, you're right. 100%. I agree with everything you're saying, and I guess because I was a child of the '70s, I grew up more. I mean, like I wasn't around well, I was alive when the Beatles were together. I remember when they split up, and I remember all that. But I grew up with their solo stuff, and as you say, the catalogs have grown. I mean, Harrison didn't do as many albums as I wish he had, but McCartney. I mean, we could do a whole show on McCartney circa 2000 to 2010.
Hmm.
But I don't differentiate, and it drives me nuts when people kind of go, "Well, it's okay." No, it's not. It's better than okay. It's brilliant.
Well, it all depends on whether or not people want to take the time and learn.
Yeah,
I just
100%.
don't understand if you really love the Beatles as a group. To me, if you listen to the solo music, you're going to like some of it. And I'm not saying you're going to like it all equally with the Beatles, and some of it you'll like more than some Beatles songs.
Right.
You know, you just have to give it a chance and invest the time. That's all.
Yeah. I'm preaching to the converted. Although I got the title wrong, I'm embarrassed, but
That's all
I'm okay.
right.
I'll get over it.
Hey, I stumbled before on the Ravi Shankar stuff, so that's okay. So you mentioned Henry McCullough.
Yeah.
Tell me about Mind Your Own Business, which I really like his version of. It's Hank
Oh,
Williams.
yeah. Anyway, so yeah.
Um, but was it just a case of George knew that he left Wings? See if I could help him out. Did Henry approach him? What? How did that all happen?
Well, that's the only album for Dark Horse that Harris it was came to Harrison recorded. And McCullough everything was recorded, brought the finished product to Dark Horse. It was through mutual friends, but George, they got George to listen to the album, and fell in love with it. He thought it was a great album. And McCulloch would always would joke. He goes, "Well, we kind of agreed on our mutual dislike for Paul," but that was a joke because McCulloch loved McCartney. It was just a joke. But so that came to Dark Horse completely separate, and it sounds funny that would be the only album that came that way, but it was, and it's a strong album that is again, he wasn't a Rory Gallagher, but he was up there. And maybe with a bit of finesse, he could have been another Rory. But I love his version of Mind Your Own Business. I love some of the other stuff is on that album. It's a strong album. Not crazy about the cover. Could have used I think they should have flipped it. I think the back picture should have been the front sleeve and then
Hmm.
just a picture of him. But that's just my being a bit critical. And no singles off the album. And when I spoke to his manager, because of course Henry's passed away, and he said that George just didn't hear a single. Um, I I I disagree, but he didn't hear a single, and they just thought they'd go for the FM market. And I think that they released a single. It might have done well, certainly in Europe and the UK. The album did okay in Germany, of all places, but you know,
Hmm.
so
What
interesting.
was when it was given to FM radio,
Yeah.
did they just completely ignore it? Did it get any airplay?
No, it actually got very little. I'm just looking up my stats here about where it's being played. It got played again. You know what? New York City played it of all places, but it didn't seem to kind of attract any other cities. I just want to say that I Can Drive a Car was my choice for a single. Just saying.
Hmm.
So and then when he did the German TV show, which is I can't pronounce it because my German is terrible.
Mhm.
It's a DVD CD set you can buy on Amazon, and you watch it. The crowd's really responsive to the stuff on the Dark Horse album or the album he released on Dark Horse Records. And but no, it didn't get any airtime. It certainly it got really rave reviews, got good reviews, except in the UK. UK were kind of sharpening their knives with that one, but
Hmm.
I don't know. Oil on My Lamp, You Better Run. Good solid album from beginning to end. Not everything is 100% brilliant, but it's a good album. But
Do you think that George had a good mind for the way the business was back then in terms of radio airplay? I bring this up because I know how much he loved Ravi Shankar. He'd have to know that Ravi's not going to get airplay even on rock radio. Maybe stations that are public radio stations, college radio stations. Um, did he was he aware of all this, or did he just say, "I love this music, I want to put it out"?
well, the fact that he had Ravi on the tour speaks up to that. I
Yeah,
think he thought, I love this music, and if people give it a chance, I mean, you know what? I Am Missing You was a perfect choice for a single and a perfect way to introduce Shankar to people.
right.
It's got beautiful melody. Um, I quite love the song myself, but Shankar Family and Friends, no, sorry, the concert, the second one, Music
Yeah,
Festival,
right.
uh, Billboard said this should get airtime on FM stations, which I thought was an interesting comment, especially in 77, or sorry, 75. I could see that comment being made in 68 because Shankar was charting. He was getting played. He played Monterey.
Right.
So I think it was a bit optimistic to think that it was going to get played on FM radio. Um, Interestingly enough, it did get played on college radio. I'm glad you brought that up because that's an area that would be a great thing to investigate is how much of this stuff got played on college radio. Shankar did. Shankar had a solid following in the college crowds. Um, but yeah, I don't know, man. I think he thought, well, Derek Green said to me, he goes, Harrison was convinced that this was going to be a big album, and he took him on tour, and Shankar Family and Friends album was out, and I think it peaked at 199 or 198 or something. It was very not great, didn't do
Yeah.
well in America, but Harrison had faith. But again, it's kind of like you and me. Like I'll hear something and I'll go, well, of course this is going to be a hit. And maybe it's my own barometer. I don't know what it is. But I don't know. He certainly, I was always fascinated that when the first Dark Horse, non-George Harrison Dark Horse to come out on CD was the Shankar Music Festival from India. It was in a box set of Shankar music. And then quickly, a few years later, both of the albums were in a box set. Shankar Family and Friends of Music Festival from India, with a couple of bonus cuts of unreleased material. And he obviously thought, that this was going to be big. And he must have felt really good when Chance, Chants of India peaked at number two on the international music charts on Billboard, behind Celtic Thunder or whatever it was. But that must have been very vindicating to Harrison. Had to have been. That after all these years, people were catching up. But that's a great album, by the way, which is now on Dark Horse. It
Hmm.
wasn't when it came out, but it's now on Dark Horse now. Um, Great album. And he worked really hard on that album. When you read about the work he put into that album, Shankar said he was working day and night on it. So, I think he thought there was a market. I think he thought if people heard it and openly, like you just said, just listen and see what you think. It's hard to get into though, right?
Hmm.
Look,
Well, for the average person who's not used to hearing Indian music, or maybe all they know is what George brought with the Beatles.
look, I mean, in 1974, you're driving in the car, you're 10 years old, you just heard the Carpenters, you go into I Am Missing You, it's going to jar you a bit. Like
Uh-huh.
let's be real. It's not exactly Partridge Family Shankar. Like it's not AM material, it's FM. I
Yeah.
could see older people on public radio for sure. But come on, like you have to but I could see Cost of Fine Town fitting in on AM between
Yes.
Elton John and I don't know, whoever. I mean, it's not that big of a stretch, or Attitudes or Jiva or whatever. But Shankar's a difference, kind of like I think John loved Yoko so much and thought that her stuff and Mrs. Lennon is a great song, but I don't know that it's going to be a hit, you know?
A
Great
lot of
song.
her stuff wouldn't have gotten airplay on AM radio at all. And just like with Ravi Shankar, it took a lot of people a long time to catch up to her.
Yeah.
And a lot of
Oh,
her music is admired now. You
yep.
you, you look at all the dance versions of her music that's sampled, and other artists, mix their musicianship with her tracks and stuff like that, or they cover her songs, and more people are aware and respectful of what she brought. And a lot of what people were making fun of, a lot of the screaming or whatever, which the B-52s admitted,
Lena
Lena
Lovitch.
Lovitch, yeah, those people. Um,
So I think it's the same with Shankar. I think it took a while, and I think it's very niche. So you're not going to go from playing, More Than a Feeling
hmm,
into a song off of Music Festival from India. But you could do a music festival from India and play. I mean, look, they didn't have the term world music back then.
yeah,
That was thank you, Peter Gabriel. But when Harrison got the very first uh, Billboard Award, Billboard Century Award, that was mentioned that he, in a way, invented world music. And I don't disagree. I agree with that 100%. Like I think that he didn't call it world music. To Harrison, it was just music.
right.
And I always loved that attitude. Like I thought, yeah, okay, it's just music. It doesn't have to be a category. You could just listen to it. And that was, and I was always intrigued that he got it before McCartney and um, before anybody. He was the first recipient of that award, which is pretty big honor.
Hmm. Now, when we're talking about George's ear and whether or not he was attuned to what was selling or how to market the music and all, you mentioned Splinter and their last album, Two Man Band. And when I listened to it, and I'm not sure, I think the guys were in the band were saying this, it's kind of like they're trying to make them into England Dead and John Ford Coley, so they were losing their identity in their own their own opinion of how they're being presented. And that had to have been a business decision that was made with George's backing, so here he's taking an idea of trying to make them more commercial or more acceptable. So how do you factor all that in with everything we've been saying?
Well, again, remember, he had just signed to Warner Brothers.
Yeah.
Warner Brothers only picked three artists to carry over: Kenny Burke, Attitudes, and Splinter. And it almost has a feeling of Warner Brothers saying, and I'm not saying this happened, I'm saying it has a feeling of Warner Brothers saying, look, we're going to give you one chance. Give us your best shot. And they brought in the heavy hitters. And um, Splinter didn't like the album. They hated the album cover, hated the name. Um, just it was just everything was wrong for them.
Hmm.
And it didn't sound like Round and Round, great song. It should have been a hit though. I mean, you're right. The England Dan, John Ford Coley, or Dan Fogelberg, or James Taylor, all those artists,
Hmm.
they were going for that sound, middle of the road, easy listening, easy rock. What do they call it now? Yacht rock.
I hate
Um,
that term. Oh,
Oceans of
I hate
Love.
that term.
I do too. I do too, with a passion. Um, Motions of Love, but it does contain. I talked to Bill, his favorite Splinter song of all time is on that album, New York City, Who Am I? Which I have to put in my top five favorite songs. It's a beautiful song. Uh, and there's not a time when I go to New York City, I don't feel like standing on the corner, Times Square, doing a Barbra Streisand, New York City, who am I? But it wasn't their album and they know it. And they wanted to be, but I think Harrison was pressured by Warner Brothers to produce hits. I mean, Good News had Ringo on it. Penny Burke didn't even get released in the UK. They just said, we're not doing it. It's not selling. It's not worth selling. So, and then if you look at 77, before the last Kenny Burke and the last Splinter singles are even released on Dark Horse, in Billboard, there's an article. Warner Brothers has dropped all the non-George Harrison Dark Horse artists, and it was just done. It's just like that. So they obviously had a say, and how much Harrison had, I don't know, but I mean that was the end of that period of Dark Horse.
Was George relieved at that
Well,
point?
I mean, he said he seems to be in 79. He seems certainly to be relieved because then he could focus on other things. But again, it's got to sting, right? It has to. There has to be an element of here we go again, Apple Records again. You know what I mean? Like there's got to be a bit of that. Maybe there wasn't, but um, which is why I'm kind of happy that Danny's resurrected the label. I mean, George isn't around, but plus Danny's heart, he's got some cool artists. He's got Billy Idol,
Cat
you know,
Stevens.
Cat Stevens, and he's got some really interesting things like John Lord, his solo career. Joe Strummer Estates putting stuff out through Dark Horse.
Leon
Le-
Russell.
Leon Russell, good stuff, right?
Hmm.
And now Steve Perry from Journey just signed in his
Oh, I didn't
Christmas.
know that.
Steve Perry is putting out an album in 2 weeks on Dark Horse. It's a Christmas album.
Wow. Okay, you heard it first right here.
Steve Perry from Journey. Yeah. So he's on Dark Horse now.
I remember
So
a few years ago, Steve Perry covered I Need You,
yes, that's right. He
and
did.
Olivia loved it. Olivia really liked his version.
That's I forgot about that. That's 100. Yeah, yeah, yeah. See, it all connects, Ken. It all connects.
Maybe Danny is signing the artist that George would have wanted. I don't know if George would have wanted Billy Idol, but
No, George was or Joe Strummer because George was not a big guy on punk, although because I included some quotations from George where he wasn't the most complimentary about punk rock. Although he said it's not my cup of tea, but I understand where it's coming from. So it's kind of
okay.
that I don't dig it, but I get it. I think Cat Stevens is a perfect choice for Dark Horse.
Yeah.
Uh, John Lord, of course, is a very good friend of George's. Leon Russell was a good friend of George. So that's nice that it's on there. I feel like I'm missing someone. Nina Simone, her first album, just got released. And a couple of things with Danny's girlfriend, and her name just escaped me for a moment, but I think of it all. Come back to that. But so I'm glad to see it's back because I think George really had a lot of faith in the label. And I really do. I don't think it was just a whim. I think it was something he took very seriously. Derek said to me, he would sit down and before any album came out, we'd go through every track. What should be the single? What should be the B-side? What should we do here? And should we, he went so far as to say, well, let's release this song in Europe. This one goes out in America. This one we'll put out in the UK. Like he was really trying for these artists. And that was all Harrison. That wasn't just the record company. Um, I know that Stair Steps released singles in different countries, and that was all George. So
That's
he
fascinating to me.
yeah.
I mean, what makes a mind say, well, this would work better in the UK or this would work better in Germany or Japan? Why should these singles be different than what's in the US? And
Yeah. That was the time, though. If you look at the music back then, that was really common. You look at certain artists who released, even Elton John would release singles in US that would have released in the UK. But Harrison really thought it through, Did it work? No, but he tried.
uh-huh.
It's all that matters. He tried. Tried.
Can you talk a little bit about the Stair Steps since you mentioned Kenny Burke?
Kenny Burke and the Stair Steps. Stair Steps had a big hit in the 1970, Ooh Child. And the B-side, Dear Prudence.
That's right.
And Dear Prudence actually charted as much, not high, but their cover version charted.
Yeah.
They were as Alvin Taylor said, they were the first family of R&B because they were before the Jacksons. They were a large family out of Chicago. Dad was a detective. Just, I love that. The fact that their father was a detective in the Chicago police force. Um, just think it's fascinating. They split up in the 70s, as families do. I'm one of five boys. Good luck getting us together. But they got back together again because of Billy Preston and the Robert Mengeleff. Probably pronounced that wrong, but Stevie Wonder,
Mm.
synthesizer guy, Tonto, big guy. Um, they got back together and Billy said to George, listen, these guys are back together. Would you be interested in signing them to Dark Horse? And Harrison jumped at the chance because Billy was involved. He trusted Billy and he loved the Stair Steps music. And he loved it.
Mm.
And From Us to You went number 10 on the R&B charts, which was actually higher than Ooh Child on the R&B charts.
Mm.
They only did the one album called Second Resurrection. Um, Great album from beginning to end. Uh, they put out some fine music. Kenny Burke, I said this, I don't know if I said it in my book, I probably didn't, but he was Prince pre-Prince. This guy was a bass player, but he played a lot of different instruments. He wrote the songs. He was a very gifted artist. Um, Still is. I mean, he's not dead, but he produced this incredible music, and he pulled the Stair Steps together to a very solid album. Now, it's funny, this album got wretched reviews in the UK, and I thought they would do better there, but they didn't. But they did really well in the US R&B stations, and again, some rock stations played them, but not a lot. But they did get played on the R&B stations. Um, it was a great album, and Kenny Burke actually re-recorded From Us to You, called it From Me to You on his solo album. By the time the solo album came out, as I said before, the band had split because they couldn't financially afford to stay in LA. All the members were living in different parts of America. So they split logistically, really. And again, maybe in 2024, where you could, do a song, send it via email, and someone could finish it off, but they couldn't do it back in 1975, 76. But it was a good project. George really believed in them, and it was seen as an important album because they had gotten back together again. It was a reunion album,
Yeah.
and there was great hopes, and I think they lived up to the hopes. And the fact that Billy was involved. I mean, bless Billy's heart, right? So I love Billy Preston. And Alvin Taylor, still to this day, when we were talking, it was his favorite album to drum on, that and 33 and a third. So, and
Wow.
that's how he got on 33 and a third. He was drumming on the stair steps, and Harrison was at a session, and he said, he called Alvin Taylor and said, "Would you be interested in coming to England and doing my 33 and a third? Well, my new album. It wasn't called 33 and a third. Um, you want?" And he did. That's how Alvin Taylor got on that album. And then Alvin hooked up with Kenny Burke, and they would work on Bill Withers together, and they worked on a lot of different albums together that Kenny Burke worked on post Dark Horse.
Yeah. I'm very impressed with their album. In fact, when I hear them, the songs from that album, it kind of reminds me. I'm trying to think of some R&B group of the 70s. I was thinking more of the Isley Brothers.
Yeah, or the Silvers, the Isley Brothers, Silvers, but definitely the Isley Brothers.
Hmm.
There's there's a real good hard sound to it, and strong vocals. A lot of really attention paid to harmonies and vocal arrangements. They were really big on the vocal arrangements, which I think the Jacksons borrowed from too. But uh, I mean, the five stair steps became the stair steps. Great band, and again, another. I mean, they were involved with Curtis Mayfield. I mean, these guys heavy hitters, right? They had Curtis Mayfield, Billy Preston, George Harrison. So they have to have something.
And just talk a little bit about Jiva, since we haven't gone into depth with them.
Jiva came to George through Olivia. Olivia knew Jiva through shared spiritual beliefs and whatnot. And they were clubbing in LA. Um, and she said, "George, come see these guys." Because George and her were dating. And he did. And he compared them to the Beatles. He said, they have that kind of four-piece sensibility, pretty straight ahead rock and roll, strong harmonies, wrote solid songs. Something's going on inside of LA and things like that. They were a top playing band. And Harrison, when I asked James Strauss, what do you think happened that you didn't sell? He said, "Aaron, we were behind the line. There was the Eagles and Stevie Wonder and Fleetwood Mac." And he goes, we just were another band in LA that I said, "You were another band in LA that had Gary Wright on it. You had George Harrison's backing, you had Dark Horse. You toured with Fleetwood Mac. No, you were not just another band in LA."
Mm,
But yeah, so I'm glad to see their music back out there again. But it's a good album. It's a solid rock album. It's very of its time. And I don't mean that in a mean way. It's just it's not dated, but it's not it's of its time. You listen to you go, "Well, that's a mid-70s album." And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's a lot of great albums you kind of go, "Yep, that's mid-70s." But George loved them and Olivia loved them, and they had support of they were connected to a gentleman who was involved with Delaney and Bonnie, and it was all kind of interconnected, right?
mm.
Uh, but again, they toured with Fleetwood Mac. I think did I put this? I put the story in about Stevie Nicks, right?
Uh,
So Stevie Nicks was a waitress, and she was wait. So their manager would go to this restaurant every day in LA, and he'd get a vegetarian omelet, only egg whites. And this is back in the 70s, right? And she kept saying, "Oh, I'm in this. I just joined the band. My boyfriend and I, we got one album." And then when they're touring, he hadn't seen Stevie for a couple of years, and she's coming off the stage. She's going, "Egg whites, vegetarian, right?" And so she's like, "What the hell are you doing here, man?" It was great. Uh, all the members talked very lovely about Fleetwood Macs. They were very good band. They allowed them sound checks, use of equipment, lights. They were very accommodating.
mm.
Um, the joke was that George Harrison basically twisted Mick Fleetwood's arm. I don't think he twisted his arm. I think it was all good fun, right? But it was a good combination. I think it was a good band open for Fleetwood Mac in 1975.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, that album before Rumors was a big album.
Yeah.
Not of the level of Rumors, but it's what led to Rumors. It's a big climb from one album to the next. You can
Harrison,
feel the momentum going for Fleetwood Mac at that time.
100%. And Harrison knew it. Harrison could see it happening, right? So what better band to get on a tour with? Unfortunately, in 75, 76, A&M pulls the plug. It just kind of blows up in Jiva's face. But so it happens. I mean, that's not an unusual story either, sadly, but it's sad for them. But they got signed to Polydor and they didn't do so well there either. But you know, Michael Landing, the lead singer, certainly had quite a career. I mean, he's Trans-Siberian Orchestra, he's done Broadway, he's done a lot. So he actually bigger than people think, Michael Lanning. So I actually saw him in Toronto. He was playing in a band, kind of like a history of rock and roll band. I brought my Jiva album cover and he signed it. It was very funny. He's like, "Oh my gosh, you knew it was me." Yeah, of course. I'm a nerd. So lovely guy.
Very nice. See, George saw the potential in these artists, whether or not they sold with Dark Horse or later on or before.
Well, like Apple, Hot Chocolate, James Taylor, Billy Preston.
Hmm,
They all had the careers after Apple. They got their start at Apple, right?
right.
So there's some parallels going on between the two.
You still got to wonder. It's always going to be a mystery to me, how could James Taylor's album not do well? And
Yeah, that's a weird one. That's an odd one. I don't understand that at all. But then again, it took him a couple more years before he really broke. Wasn't it 71 that James Taylor broke?
yeah, with Fire and Rain, Sweet Baby
Yes.
James.
That's about 3 years. So who knows? I mean, then we could talk about Ringo records. And I mean, there was only one big record on Ringo records, Graham Bonnet. But
That'll be interesting. I mean, to me, I'm fascinated by who the Beatles liked or what artists that they saw something in them.
yeah,
There's a curiosity factor there, at least for me. I'm interested in that aspect of it all. So before we go,
yeah.
um, I want to ask you one thing about you could say it's a rumor, but it's been talked about where George Harrison is concerned. And that's that when the Beatles Anthology came out, George Harrison was obviously involved with it, being interviewed for the anthology project, and of course contributing on the newer songs, the John Lennon songs and all. But he had a problem with handmade films because even though the company did extremely well on a lot of their films commercially, um, they were going bankrupt because of his business partner, Dennis O'Brien. And so I've heard, and I want to know if you can shed some light on this, that the only reason, or the main reason, why George got involved with the Beatles anthology was to recoup the losses of what he had suffered from Handmade. And to me, I look at it as I don't really know how much truth there is to that because why wouldn't George want to be involved with the Beatles anthology and at least tell his side of the story as something that he was very proud of?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes George does knock those days depending upon his mood, but ultimately he's proud of what he achieved in the Beatles and, the music that they created. And so what are your feelings about that? Do you know anything behind all this? Is there a level of truth to that?
I'm in the same boat as you. I don't have any confirmation. I've heard the rumors. I've also heard the rumors that that was why he toured Japan with Eric Clapton was to recoup money. That was a quick way to get a lot of money. I mean, the tour was very short,
Hmm.
very successful, and then of course he released the live album and didn't do very well, but it did something. I've heard the same rumors. Nothing's been confirmed. I sometimes wonder about that myself because I think Harrison, if he hadn't wanted to be involved in anthology, it simply wouldn't have happened. And I think that the Beatles, John, George, and Ringo, or sorry, Paul, George, and Ringo, obviously met about it, obviously talked about it, obviously planned it. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't like, I mean, the amount of work that went into the interviews and all that, and then the book. and the album and getting George Martin involved again. I don't believe that it's just purely a financial thing for George. I do think that he did recoup money. I think that it helped him. I do know that he lost a ton of money from Dennis O'Brien. And although he won the lawsuit with Dennis, he never got a penny because Dennis basically declared bankruptcy and didn't pay him any of the money that Harrison was awarded.
Hmm.
And I read a book about handmade films, and Nuns on the Run was a big film. It made money, but yet Handmade died, which is like Dark Horse, but except Handmade was much more successful than Dark Horse Records. And
Yeah.
the joke was, Neil Innes said, um, no, Ray Cooper said, Dark Horse had an office in London, and in the little corner there was a desk that was Handmade Films. By the time 1990, it was Handmade Films, and there was this little desk for Dark Horse. So it kind of flip-flopped. I don't I would I don't know, Ken. I don't have an answer. I've heard the same rumors. I've read it online. A couple of books speculated it. Again, I'm going to go back to what I did read, which was that the tour was definitely helped him for a short term to get some money in very quickly. And
Hmm.
I think Harrison actually enjoyed the tour. I don't think because as soon as he finished the tour, he did a couple of benefit shows in England where he made no money at all. I mean, he did the Doug Henning concert for his forget the name of the political party, but he did that concert. I got a recording of it. So who knows? I think that if he was doing it just for the money, they would have just put out Free as a Bird. There was a lot of work in that. I mean, it wasn't just a one-off thing.
Hmm.
TV, and I think Harrison, when you cut to the quick, he was very proud of the Beatles. He was very proud of the message the Beatles had. He talked about the messages the Beatles had, which was usually peace and love. And yeah, was he a bit bitter about some of the stuff with Lennon and McCartney? Well, of course he was, and he had every right to be. But bitter, look, you know, I'm one of five boys, and of course, like any family, you have the little squabbles, but when push comes to shove, you're still family. There's so your brothers, and I think that was the Beatles. I really do. I think that, Lennon too. I mean, you look at the Lennon interviews near the end of his life, he was very complimentary of the Beatles. I think George was the same. I think George in the 90s had time to reflect. Um, And I think he loved doing anthology. He certainly seemed to. I mean, I don't know how you could put on those interviews, or he's quite funny and quite animated. So is Paul, but George is good in those things. So no, I don't know. But I don't know. It doesn't take away from it, I guess. I don't know.
No, I would just want to believe that he did it because he genuinely wanted to be a part of it. And George flip-flops in his attitude towards the Beatles. He could be down on them one moment and then he's recording When We Was Fab, and or the Dark Horse video where he's in the Sergeant Pepper uniform, or one minute he could be, downplaying the Beatles. So, they had some good tunes, you know, but then when push comes, it's kind of like, it's fine for him to be critical of the Beatles, but if someone else is, watch him defend them.
Yeah. There's a great clip. He's promoting 33 and a third. And you must have seen it online. And he's watching the Beatles do This Boy live.
Oh yeah, on Ed Sullivan. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's got that, that sweater he was wearing in 76,
Yeah.
and he's digging every second of it. I mean, he's genuine, he has nothing bad to say. I agree with you. I want to think that George did it because he wanted to be part of that, as opposed to I need money. So I just I don't see it that way myself. I just think it's a nice story, not a nice story, but it's a nice rumor to have. But I've not seen anything to support it. We do know that he did lose a shitload or a ton of money,
Mm.
a ton of money thanks to Dennis O'Brien. But the tour, everything else kind of. I mean, that was that. I feel bad for if it's not Klein, it's Dennis O'Brien. Like poor guy. Like honestly, just couldn't cut a break there.
Yeah. Or, depending on how you look at it, how he was treated with A&M.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of, I think Harrison had a lot of struggles. Um, and the more I dug into his struggles, the more I thought, yeah, I could see why this guy would be kind of a bit bristly at times. Understandably, I would be too. I mean, one of the first publishers who was interested in my book said, "Yeah, it's okay, but can you put some more stuff about his personal life? Maybe it was some drug stuff." And no, that's not the book I'm writing. I want to, and I was a bit upset because I didn't get the first publisher said they were going to publish it, then they turned it down, and because I wasn't willing to do that. But I just kept on working on it. So that's a really small taste of what Harrison went through. Very small. I'm not comparing myself to George Harrison, but I understand the feeling of kind of getting the wind knocked out of your sails. And he had the wind knocked out of his sails an awful lot.
Yeah.
But he kept bouncing back, man, and proving people like Wilburys, right up. I mean,
Brainwashed. Well, that was
what's
released
that?
after his death. But the music on Brainwashed.
Yeah. Or even when he did the reissue of All Things Must Pass in 2000.
Hmm.
Amazing. And he did the new version of My Sweet Lord.
Right.
Fantastic. And we didn't even talk about My Sweet Lord. We're not going to, but that was another one.
That's that's another setback in his life. But actually, the outcome was very interesting of that
Yes,
court.
it was. Yeah.
We'll save that for another time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I promise you that.
Now,
Yeah.
since we hinted about this earlier, and you mentioned it in my other podcast show, but you are working on a book on the Ringo label.
Well, I'm working on Ringo in the 70s. So
Okay.
it's from January 1st, 1970 to December 31st, 1979.
Okay.
And part of that is two things in Ringo's life that doesn't get a lot of exploration. One is Ringo or Robin Limited, which was a designing company that he had in the UK.
Uh-huh.
The other was his own label, Ringo Records, which he started in 75, distributed by Capital EMI in North America and distributed by Polydor, Polygram in the rest of the world. And I was, talking to a gentleman at the Beatle convention. He goes, "Well, I think I got all of the Ringo records. I got Bobby Keys and I got this." I said, "Well, no, it's like 5 albums and 10 singles." And it was an interesting. I spoke to one gentleman who was on the label and gave me some insight into Ringo Records years, which is very interesting. Graham Bonnet was the only one that had a hit, and I talked extensively to him about his album on Ringo Records and how it came about and how the song became. I mean, the hit he had was written by the Bee Gees. That was never recorded by the Bee Gees, and the song is just skipped my head right now. But that's because it's my age. But he
Not coming
what's
to my head either. So,
but so I'm looking for I'm enjoying I'm interviewing people about Ringo and trying to talk to get some access to archives and studios. And no one's really written about the Ringo the Fourth Rotogravure Bad Boy years. And
uh-huh.
Bad Boy was actually recorded mostly in Toronto, um, as a kind of a tax dodge, but it was recorded in Toronto, and that was kind of cool.
Uh-huh.
Toronto and so yeah, that's what I'm working on. And
Yeah.
I'm also working on a book on a Canadian band called Plateau.
Sure. We've all
That
heard.
everyone knows Plateau, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully next year I'll have a couple of books coming out.
But that part of the 70s with Ringo working with Vinnie Poncia is something that I'm fascinated by because he wrote a lot of songs with him,
Now, if
especially
you
Ringo the Fourth album. So
and I would love to talk to Vinny. Do you have a number?
no. I was gonna ask you.
No, I don't.
Anybody,
But if you,
anybody watching have
anyone,
his
could you
phone number?
please email me first?
All right,
I,
email me second.
no, but I mean, Ringo the Fourth was other than 4 tracks was all written by Vinnie Poncia and Ringo Starr. I mean, that was
Yep.
pretty big. Ringo wrote almost the whole album with Vinnie Poncia, right?
Six
And
of the 10 songs, and then the B side of Just a Dream was written with,
which
which
okay,
is a great song to me.
Lost Gem. Oh
Yeah.
my God, great song.
All right. For people to get a copy of your book, they can do so on Amazon,
Yep,
Barnes and Noble, any
yep.
other place.
Walmart, any bookstore. And if you can actually go to your local bookstore, they can order it and get it in stock for you. Here in Canada, it's available through Indigo and Chapters, and in the UK, Waterstones. So yeah, it's available everywhere.
Okay. Before we go, I meant to ask you about your career in radio. because you had a syndicated Beatles show, right?
Did called Beatles Universe for 6 years. And I called it Beatles Universe for the exact same reason you mentioned earlier. I was fascinated by stuff that the Beatles liked. So I would play Beatles, but I'd also play stuff that they played on or Apple. I was playing Dark Horse stuff, Ringo Records. I remember one of the radio stations calling me up going, that song you played by Colonel Doug Boogie, what was that? Yeah, long story short, on Ringo Records.
Yeah.
No, it was a good. I enjoyed doing that show, and I got to interview people like May Pang and people like that, and it was good fun. But it was
Sounds it sounds a lot like my radio show.
100%.
Because, I've said this often, but one of the first Beatle books I ever got was the All Together Now book, the discography. And so it had chapters in there of songs the Beatles produced for others, songs they appeared on for others, the BBC recordings, the original artists behind the songs the Beatles covered. And to me, that was all one big catalog. I
Well,
never looked at the Beatles as this is the Beatles and this is the solo, because it was all part of one book. And
I
that really influenced me. And that's how I carry a Beatles show to this day.
you were very similar, and to that end, I was in New York City. I went to see David Gilmour, and I was in a record store, and I found a copy. And this I'm bringing it up because it's in the book altogether now. I found a copy of Paul and John's I'm Walking. And it's of course not John and Paul, but they mentioned about it being, people thought it was John and Paul or whatever. I finally found a copy of it. It's taken me since 76 to find the bloody thing, but I finally got it. 2.99. Who knew? New York City, Generation Records. There you go.
That's part of the fun was looking for a lot of those records. And of course, most of them you could probably find on YouTube right now.
I know,
You
but back then we couldn't. We didn't have YouTube, right?
know? No. But the struggles I went through to find Fourth of July by John Christie. Oh my
Oh,
God.
I just found that last year. It's
A
taken me this.
45 copy?
Yes.
Okay.
Picture sleeve too. I I've been looking for that since I saw that in the book. I've been looking and bidding and losing. So I finally got a copy. There's a few of them in there like that that some of them I've given up hope with, but that one was I kept looking for it. Great song too.
Oh, definitely. And I love Paul's demo of it
Me too. Me
on
too.
Maintenance to Mars. I
Yeah.
never knew that existed, but
Hey, thank you, box sets.
all right. So thank you so much, Aaron, for doing this.
Thank you for having me
Uh,
on. It's always a pleasure. I love talking to you.
you
I
know,
can
I,
hang out all
I,
day.
I talked to you earlier. Well, maybe we'll do this on another show, but I wanted you to just have a sampler of songs that you wanted to pick, but we'll do that at another time.
Sounds good. I will do that with you anytime. Just let me know and I'm there for you, man.
Yeah. You pick your own best of Dark Horse.
Okay, I'm in. Count me
Okay. So we're going to include in the description box the Amazon link for this, Barnes and Noble, whatever I can. And by all means, if you can, if you're interested in what you just heard, check out the music on the Dark Horse label. So much of it you can find right now on YouTube, the ones
Yeah.
we discussed, all these different artists. Okay. Thanks so much, folks, for tuning in.
Thank you, guys.
See you again real soon. Take care.